But today I'm going to talk about Tekkalakota, and I think some of these details, some of you have already heard, but my plan is to outline the history of research and talk a little bit about our future plans, and then try to discuss some of the broader implications of this research. And then I'll today focus specifically more on the context of the Iron Age remains that we have here. So Tekkalakota is located in Siruguppa Taluk of Ballari district in northern Karnataka. And so it is in this semi-arid interior of the peninsula, which is known for the rocky landscape, rich mineral deposits, and this evidence we have for very long sequences of human occupation, which has been documented at many archaeological sites in the region. So Tekkalakota has long been known as a site type of the Southern Neolithic. So that means it defines what we think of as a Southern Neolithic. And excavations were conducted on the central hill of Tekkalakota in the 1960s by Dr. M.S. Nagaraja Rao. And there he documented evidence for habitation, human burials, and rock art that dated from early 3rd through mid-2nd millennium BCE. And so additionally, these excavated sites of Nagaraja Rao were sampled by a team that was working on early processes of domestication and regional patterns of subsistence in the 1990s. So Dr. Ravi Korisetter and Dorian Fuller and their team. So this Zoom control, sorry, is getting in the way of my slide. Here we go. So Tekkalakota also has very substantial remains, in addition to the Neolithic, that would date to the subsequent cultural periods. That includes the Iron Age, early historic period, and medieval era also. So these later remains, particularly those that were associated with Iron Age and early historic periods, were the subject of a systematic survey and surface collection project that I did with Ashok Abkari in 2005. And during the survey, we documented a number of sites and features that spanned the Neolithic through medieval periods. So I'll quickly discuss my general findings from this 2005 survey and then come back to some of the relevant sites shortly. So the original focus of this study in 2005 had actually been the Ashokan edicts that are located nearby at Nittur and Udagolam. And when we looked in these areas around the edicts, there was no evidence for any significant occupation or activity, though we did find some evidence for megalithic activity. So this upper right, you see there's one urn burial there that was close to the Nittur edicts. And then here you see, I think, like a cyst burial or something by the Udagolam edicts with that capstone removed. But unfortunately, because of the rice paddy cultivation near the Nittur edicts and the quarrying that has happened over the years at the Udagolam edicts, these megaliths are largely destroyed, and the context of these edicts is now mostly destroyed. But really, it's evident that there is no major occupation by these two edicts, and the main features that we have are the megaliths. So really, in those later periods also, the major occupations, again, looking at this map, are at Tekkalakota. So I'll quickly show you sort of the major Iron Age early historic sites that we have at Tekkalakota, and then I'll again come back to some of these areas to talk about our future plans. So based on the surface remains, and this is primarily identifying ceramic types, and then also presence or absence of iron slag and lithics, microliths, we find two major areas of Iron Age and early historic activity on two sides of the Tekkalakota Hills. So this one side is Tek 3, also known as Gaudra Mule, and then Bali Tota is we call Tek 8 on this other side. And then in between them, lying in the hills, is a very large reservoir. So it's a natural water collection area, and it's been reinforced over the years. So in addition to these sites sort of on this side of the hills, we have a little bit to the south, two additional sites, Tek 6 and Tek 7, and these are areas that still require testing. And really the observations we have about these sites are from the surface remains alone at present. Tek 7, the southernmost site, I won't say much about it, except the reason it was marked out is because in 2005, Ashok found a punch mark coin on the surface there. There weren't very many other significant remains. And really, in addition to the Ashokan edicts and a few beads, this is right now the only real evidence for any interaction with the north. that we have. So it's an interesting place, but one that we need to look at a little bit more. Tech 6 I'll come back to more about. It lies just below the Neolithic settlement that Nagaraja Rao had excavated in the 60s. So there's something going on there that I will speak about in a moment. So in addition to these areas, we also have evidence for very substantial medieval remains, and these have never been systematically documented. But I think it helps to demonstrate that this area of Tekkalakota has been a thriving center of human activity from at least the third millennium BC. And I think in really thinking about why this was such an important center, we need to start looking at the production history and economic history of this place. So this earlier research that we had done in 2005 was designed to investigate the nature of North Indian imperial interaction in the south because of those two Ashokan edicts at Nittor and Udagulam. But very quickly, it turned towards a consideration of those long-term and local continuities and the implication that this diachronic regional perspective has for our understanding of how social complexity develops in South India. So moving on to sort of our more recent work, our team began excavations in 2019. So this was a partnership between myself and Dr. Shobha V from University of Mysore. And I don't know if she's here now. I know I saw her a little bit earlier signed in. But if she's here, feel free to jump in, Shobha, and add any details. So we began our excavations in 2019, and our goals had been to identify which were the major deposits associated with the Iron Age and early historic. And there were some Neolithic features I'll show you in a moment that we were also interested in investigating. And sort of more generally, we were interested in trying to understand the connections between the different areas and the different cultural periods that we have represented at Tekkalakota. And the hopes are can set ourselves up for a larger program of intensive excavation and exploration that we will hopefully begin in the next few years. So I'll outline what we know so far and then tell you a little bit about where we hope to go with it. So this first season of excavations, we were able to excavate in 4 areas, which you see marked on this map. So our first set of test excavations was actually not at Tekkalakota, but it was a little bit a ways at this Neolithic ash mound, which is at the base of a hill, which is known as Jakeragudda. So this is approximately 1 kilometer northeast of the Udagulam edicts and 3 kilometers west of Tekkalakota. And we were able to open up 2 test units, one sort of in the center and then one at the base. This photograph in the lower right-hand side is at the base. So you can kind of see, if you see my arrow, that sort of edge of the ash mound, we were able to capture get some radiocarbon dates from below that edge of the ash mound and compare it to the dates that we got from the ash mound itself. And you can kind of see all the dates are neatly fall within the middle of the Neolithic period. And they also show or indicate that this may have been a relatively quickly constructed feature. If you see the dates are relatively close. So if you look at the hill behind Jakeragudda, that itself is also covered with a lot of rock art and a lot of grinding slicks. So this is a very interesting area that definitely deserves future investigation. So you see here in the lower right-hand picture, this is a view of the ash mound with the Jakeragudda hill, I think, or the one next to it in the background. But you can see the hills of Tekkalakota from this ash mound, and this sort of rock that's sticking up is a very prominent landmark of the landscape. So it's interesting that you have that visibility, and you can start thinking about the connections between these places and these communities. So I think for the purposes of our discussion today on Iron Age, I think really what we can talk about with the ash mound is that the presence of this kind of feature, as we see, many ash mounds in this region, it really indicates the emerging pyrotechnical capacity of the communities in this area. And again, for the purposes of metallurgy, this is an important consideration. So the second set of test units that we opened up is when we can really start thinking more specifically about Iron Age, or at least iron production. So this is that reservoir that is between those 2 major Iron Age early historic sites at Tekkalakota. And so in this reservoir in 2005, you see here, just on this one side, there was a very dense scatter of slag. It's a huge just pile of slag, which we saw in 2005. So when we returned in 2019, we had excavated 2 test units in that pile itself, hoping to find some production evidence or something, but it really ended up or turned out to be just one big compact pile of slag. So you just see a very, very dense sort of accumulation of slag, and then we actually had to stop because these large stones started coming up, but there were no artifacts, no production evidence, nothing in that area. Also, even on the slopes of the hills, there's a rock shelter nearby. So this is a very curious area that, again, I think needs more investigation, but it has brought up 2 questions. And the first question is where this big pile of slag is coming from, or where it was actually being produced. And then also, I think, when, because we don't have a date for these remains just yet. And I guess the second question, somewhat related, is if this slag is not being produced in this location, then why was it being brought here and piled up so close to this major water source at this reservoir? And, one possibility maybe is that it was being used as a construction material to build some earlier bund for the reservoir, which again is a natural water collection area that's been built up. So I think these are questions that we should continue to think about, but we can also keep thinking about as we look at the next 2 areas that we tested in 2019. And we do have some radiocarbon dates for one of these areas. So the first one, the place where we have the radiocarbon dates, was where we put our 3rd set of test units, this place called Baletota, or we refer to it as Tech 8. So much of this area has been disturbed. You can kind of see this is the collection map from 2005 of that site. And just only this shaded green portion, this upper portion here, is intact, and the rest has sort of been plowed away for agricultural purposes and is disturbed. But really, when we look at that one unit, even in that undisturbed portion, it's a very small unit, only 1 by 1 meters. Still, we found a wealth of evidence that really allows us to pinpoint the transition between the Iron Age and the early historic period. So we were able to date 2 radiocarbon, 2 charcoal samples, one from the bottom of the unit, so sort of in the very base of it. And I will say that the deposits continue past where we ended our unit. We had to close it up for practical purposes, but we had not hit sterile soil. And then we took one sort of more from the middle of the unit, around here, locus 30. So this middle date had a date of the 1st or 2nd century BC to mid 1st century AD, and then this bottom date was, I think, sometime between the 8th and mid 7th century BC. And so again, I think that really nicely captures an important transition phase from the Iron Age to early historic. And I think for the purposes of our discussion, it's also worth noting that the iron slag sort of continued throughout the unit all the way down until the bottom. And again, that deposit continued past the point where we had stopped. So another thing to note is that we also had some graffiti marked sherds at the very bottom, but I won't go into that today. But what you also see, if you look sort of at the profile of this the section of the wall, you'll see there's some thin lenses of a white substance, and also some granule nodules with this white substance were found, and also iron particles in the unit, and then also on the surface around the unit. And we think this white substance is the slaked lime. So you can ask where this slaked lime is coming from, and it appears to be coming from the last place where we did our test excavations in 2019. This is the Gaudramule, or Tech 3, on the other side of that reservoir, the other side of the Tekkalakota Hills. So we had, done the surface collection in 2005, and you see the chart sort of comparing all the different sites and the different types. And really this examination suggested that this Tech 3 is contemporaneous with Tech 8, with that Baletota I just showed you, although we don't have any radiocarbon samples from this location just yet, but it's very rich in surface remains. So when we had done the test units across this site, actually what it had showed is most of the site is disturbed. So the uppermost levels had, a very high density of artifacts, and they were completely mixed, and then it dropped off very quickly, I would say probably about 40, 50 centimeters or so. And that would suggest that we had at one time a very rich deposit of early historic remains, and maybe even Iron Age remains, but that it was a shallow deposit and very quickly or easily disturbed from the plowing activities. So if you see this one location here of the Tech 3, it's a little bit that whitish soil. And again, from these photographs, this aerial view, you'll see this sort of ashy part of soil in the innermost location of this site. And again, this is that slate lime material, which I think even the local people would come in, they would tell us that they would take the soil from this place and use it to make the plaster for the floors of their houses. So this slate lime actually seems to be coming from this boulder. So you see different angles of it in these photographs. And this boulder is kind of located on this edge, along the edge of this site just here, basically. And we haven't excavated adjacent to this boulder just yet, but this is certainly on our list of the next things to do. But we had excavated some units around it, and those were disturbed. But again, they didn't yield any evidence of production. So no tuyers, no crucibles or anything, just slag is present, and this slate lime sort of deposit. So this same sort of deposit was actually noted on the equipment of the local blacksmith in Tekkalakota. So this is his sort of equipment there, and you can see that same whitish substance there. And the blacksmiths in Tekkalakota, they no longer produce iron or engage in this work, but from discussions with them, we learned that their ancestors had used the lime in the past to generate the heat. And they had told us about the source of that limestone that they were using, and it is actually this source right here. This is a limestone outcropping that is close to Udagalom. It's not a very large one, but this is according to the local people what their ancestors were using in the past. So this is what we have so far from our 2019 research. So before we conclude, I just want to highlight one more area which I had shown you earlier. And this has yet to be systematically studied, but I think it's relevant for our discussion. I think it's an important location, and that is this Tech 6, which is just below that original excavation site of Nagaraja Rao. So in 2005, I had identified it as a site because there was a small water collection area in the corner of this site. You can kind of see it's sort of been reinforced by a bund sometime in the past there. So that now has sort of been destroyed. And this photograph you see here is from Nagaraja Rao's site looking down onto this Tech 6. And there's a much larger tank that's been constructed there. But both in 2005 and in later years, when we have looked at the eroding material out of these bunds and the back dirt that comes from this construction, we would find the ceramics and the iron slag. And I've just noted that there is no RCPW, or very, very little compared to what we would see at the other sites, but you would find the black and red ware and the pieces of iron slag. And possibly in this jumble of stones here, there would be some megalithic alignments, but that we still have yet to confirm. So my hypothesis is that this site was representing that Neolithic Iron Age transition, or maybe also the early Iron Age. But this is something we need to confirm with our excavations and with radiocarbon dating. But I think it's important to do this and to ask these questions for several somewhat related reasons. I think the first reason is there's often assumed to be a break in occupation or an abandonment at many sites in this region at the end of the Neolithic period. And this is often linked to climatic change. But there are some sites in this region that do have some continuity over time. So for example, at Karibakale, that site has continuity. But Corey Sector and Fuller and their teams had speculated that Tekkalakota was like Sanganakalu and other nearby sites and had been abandoned at the end of the Neolithic. And if you were to just look at the central hill of Tekkalakota, where Nagaraja Rao had done his work, this may seem to be the case. And I think here my argument is similar to what Dr. Selva Kumar had mentioned in his paper as well, that once you start looking around and you sort of don't take a single site approach, but you look at the wider area, you will find that evidence for continuity of occupation. So I think we do have that continuity at Tekkalakota. It just comes with some shifting settlement over time. And I think the pattern is really what we see similar at many sites is people in the Neolithic are more on the tops of the hills and slowly they come down to the base. And at Tekkalakota, slowly the occupation seems to have moved northward. The medieval portion is sort of just north of that Tech 8, and then the modern village is just north of that. So why I think it becomes particularly important to examine this Neolithic Iron Age transition, or this early Iron Age period, I think it brings to mind another comment that was made, I think yesterday, by Professor K.P. Rao in his paper. That comment he made about the co-occurrence of the megaliths with the Neolithic sites in regions like Bellary district. And I think that main point that is needs to be made is that these Iron Age traditions are developing out of local Neolithic traditions. And this becomes important, I think, because earlier debates about the origins of the megaliths and the origins of iron technology would often rely on these external explanations like migration and colonization, or even just simple diffusion of, the more complex society to the presumably less complex societies of South India. And I think these kinds of theories have sometimes been reinforced with the genetic or linguistic arguments, and I'll put that in quotes because I don't think it's very reinforcing or convincing an argument, because as I think many of us here know, if you look at the archaeology, it is very evident that these are local developments. And I think Tekkalakota is really an excellent place to document these kinds of local developments as they're happening. So our team has been able to identify these areas with the intact cultural deposits that range from this early 3rd millennium BC until the mid 1st century CE. And doesn't just involve looking at Tekkalakota, but also in those surrounding areas like at Jakaragudda, where we have the ash mound and rock art and all those other features. And again, this period spans many important transitions and developments in South Indian antiquity, which includes the shift towards a settled agrarian lifestyle, the adoption of iron technology, and also the adoption and the emergence of written traditions. So our future work is really geared towards understanding the emergence of those latter two phenomena, iron technology and then also writing, we hope to investigate as well. And it's really structured on the premise that to understand these processes of development, you must, number one, examine that long-term perspective in the region, beginning with the Southern Neolithic. And secondly, that you have to take more of a landscape view that focuses on the area around Tekkalakota and all all the hills, and not just this site-specific approach that has really driven a lot of the earlier research. And again, this is very much like what Dr. Selvakumar was mentioning in his paper. So in our future plans, I think there are some components of our project that are still developing. We are now starting to investigate the medieval portions of the site as well. And we also have some ongoing analysis from our materials recovered from our 2019 excavation. So at Kerala University, I know Dr. Abayan and his students will be examining our fauna. And then we are now also partnering with Dr. Sharda Srinivasan and Dr. Udaya Kumar from National Institute of Advanced Studies to look at our iron. So I look forward to some of the results and to sharing that with you in the future. And in our immediate plans, and hopefully next winter this will be able to happen, I would like to do some testing at Tech 6, and then maybe try to put some test units near that boulder with the lime deposit at Tech 3. And then when possible, we would like to go back and do a larger scale excavation at that intact deposit at Baletota, and really to continue to explore and examine all those different locations where we have this evidence for some stage of the iron production process. And again, it's scattered across that landscape. So I think all of these things that I presented have more to do with the technical details of analysis and how we understand the Iron Age in the Southern Deccan and at Tekkalakota. But we can also think about some of the broader implications of this work. And here I think, again, this would match with some of the arguments that the other participants in this session and in other sessions have been able to make. So when we think about the intellectual merit of this project, really, number one, as I said before, it's really shown the importance of this landscape approach that thinks about a wider range of sites collectively instead of this site-specific view, because that can really limit your visibility. And you really need to understand sort of the contemporaneous activities and communities over time. And then similarly, I think we can emphasize this diachronic approach and think about the long-term occupation history at Tekkalakota and these transitional periods when these early, social and technological transformations are beginning to emerge. Another thing that we ask with this project is really what we mean when we talk about social complexity in archaeology. And I think, continued research across South India has demonstrated that societies in South India as a whole, not just the Southern Deccan, were innovative, they were dynamic from very early periods of prehistory. And I think it's important to focus on these local patterns of material culture instead of always thinking about this evidence for external contexts like these Ashokan edicts and so on. So I think this project is really trying to contribute to our understanding of these regional cultures as complex, despite the fact that they remain relatively small scale over time until later periods. And I think this becomes a contrast to those conventional models that we see in archaeology that will interpret measures of complexity based on scale or on the presence of urbanism or the state. So I think this is in many ways coordinating with that broader archaeological literature that talks about the development of complex societies and this concern with the definition of terms and the way that a lot of these terms are shaped by paradigms of social evolution. So we're making this argument that, societies in the Southern Deccan are really an important comparative case study to talk about social complexity and the origins of social complexity. And we're now beginning to get the empirical detail to validate some of those arguments. So really, in all of this, theoretically, we're engaging with this question of what is complexity, and we're drawing rather from that archaeological definition, from the definition of Herbert Simon's idea of a complex system as one that is made up of a large number of parts that interact in non-simple ways. And I think by framing the theoretical issues of this project in such a manner, we can keep on thinking about what the origins and meaning of social complexity are in a way that sort of steps away from that social evolutionary framework and tries to link everything to urbanism and the state and sort of that checklist of complexity that exists in archaeology. And we can now add these concrete examples of iron and writing technology to this discussion. So our project is also emphasizing this idea of micropolitics, which focuses on, sort of individual decision making and sort of individual action. And it's really reflecting our position that, when you develop and adopt transformative technologies like iron technology and writing as well, that this occurs through individual decision making processes, and that these processes are what will scale upwards and outwards over time. So by drawing on this approach of micropolitics or keeping it in mind, we're going to argue that these communities at Tekkalakota and across the Southern Deccan are not only witnessing these emerging technologies of metallurgy and literature, but they're active participants in the development and uptake of these technologies. And again, this is a contrast to those conventional models that we often see in South Asian prehistory as a whole, that look at South Indian societies as these very passive recipients of political and cultural flows from North India and other places. And I think this brings up some very important questions about scale, complexity, and really the directionality of interregional interaction. So just to conclude, I think it's really evident that Tekkalakota has for a very long time been in a very important regional center in the Southern Deccan. And I think beyond the Neolithic, that importance continues. And our team has really been able to recover enough evidence to tell us that we have, representative we have sites representing these time periods across this area. And hopefully with continued research, we'll be able to really elaborate on the economic and social processes that made Tekkalakota such an important center over time. So I think where I'll stop for now, but there's many people and organizations that should be thanked for the work that we have been able to do. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Abayan again for inviting me to participate in this webinar, and to all the webinar organizers and participants as well. And again, I think I have a few moments for any questions, but my email addresses are here. So I certainly invite anybody to please be in touch with questions or comments. And certainly I invite any suggestions based on what I've spoken about today. So thank you very much.